Special thank you to the leadership and congregation of First Presbyterian. Faith Action, that big White House across the street, really wouldn't exist without your support and your care. And it may have been easier at one point to turn that into a parking lot. Would have made parking for tonight's event a little bit easier, but I'm glad you didn't, because there's some really life-affirming, life-changing, even life-saving work that goes on over there every single day. I grew up in a small town on the Indiana-Kentucky border, fishing on the Ohio River, Little League, performing in musicals like Oklahoma. And what my town really had in rustic charm, it seriously lacked in cultural, religious, and racial diversity. So you can imagine what a shock it was for me when at 21 I moved to the most diverse neighborhood in the entire world to try to be a hotshot actor, Queens, New York. And for the first time in my life, I felt like a complete stranger, kind of like that kid who, after pays the lunch man or lunch lady, doesn't know what table he's supposed to sit at. So I walked around Queens a lot with my head down, and thankfully some people in that community started reaching out to me. I remember the first Filipino immigrant man I had met. He got me a sweet deal on my cell phone, and I know that sounds silly, but at the time it was significant. The first Muslim man I had met, he had fled Iraq. He had been a doctor there, and he had to start all over again in the United States, so he was a Subway sandwich maker. I lived off of that Subway sandwich as a poor actor 7 days a week, and I remember I walked in with my head down, shuffling my feet. He says, "Hey, what do you do?" I mumbled something. He said, "Actually, don't even tell me. You're trying to be an actor, aren't you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Don't worry, I'll put some extra meat and cheese on your sandwich." And just as I was thinking, you know what, this diversity thing is not something to fear. Maybe I have a place here. 9/11 happened. And I was actually at an acting audition that morning, just about a few blocks north of when the first tower was struck. Caught the last train back to Queens, went under the East River up to the Greensboro Bridge stop. You have a beautiful view of the lower half of Manhattan, and watch both of the towers fall from there. And like most everybody in this room, it's probably the closest we've come as a nation to feeling like the world may very well be coming to an end. And so the natural human instinct was fear. And so part of me said, I need to go right back to Indiana to be back with people like me, where I'm safe. And another part of me said, David, don't give in to the fear. Breathe, hang in there. It'll be okay. So I had this tension inside myself, and I went to church to kind of work it out, the Riverside Church in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And that church had a program to go and visit immigrants and asylum seekers inside of detention center, which had really exploded post 9/11. The last time I had heard about detention centers was in high school, when we learned about the Japanese internment camps that our country has largely come to have shame about 75 years later. And so we went to the outskirts of Newark Airport, to this colorless, windowless, abandoned airport warehouse, and inside were 250 people from dozens of different countries, including a Tibetan Buddhist woman fleeing Chinese religious persecution after her husband had been shot and killed, a West African man fleeing near genocide in the early 2000s, a Colombian woman who had been kidnapped and forced to be a dental assistant and was raped by a guerrilla group fighting the military in Colombia. And so I went inside. First had to go through security, kind of like you do at an airport. Went into this colorless, kind of dank visitation room. There was a bulletproof glass between us, and out walked these folks in blue and orange jumpsuits. Didn't speak the same language, not the same culture. I didn't know what I was going to say. There's a little barbed wire mesh hole that you'd bend down to talk to each other through. And most of the time early on, we just kind of looked at each other. At least they were getting some humanity and empathy in the eyes, which they weren't really getting much of from the guards. Over time, we would write and draw pictures of our home and our family and hold them up to the windows. Over time, we started to learn a little bit of one another's language. They'd tell me about their life inside, that for a couple of years, they hadn't smelled fresh air. They weren't allowed outside. Felt like they had no human rights, little to no medical or physical health care. They were put in solitary confinement if they spoke out too much. And then they'd ask me about my acting auditions. I was like, the heck with my acting auditions. How are you? And they said, no, this is not charity. This is friendship. Going one week, one Saturday turned into going almost every Saturday for 8 years. And those folks inspired me so much by their courage, their resilience. I felt like I had a chance to see the best of the human spirit inside of one of America's darkest places. They inspired me so much that I quit acting. Auditioning for Mamma Mia just wasn't that important anymore. And went to seminary, got an additional degree in human rights with the intersect at faith and migration. And today I'm a Christian pastor because of my Tibetan Buddhist, West African Muslim, Catholic Colombian friends that I met inside of detention who changed my life. And I share the story so you understand that I have no political agenda on this issue of immigration, one of the most heatedly debated one in our countries these days. But as someone who's been cracked open to the reality of many immigrants in the United States, especially those with limited or no status, and someone who's been deeply affected by the transforming relationships that I've had with them, it's become extremely personal for me. Not as a progressive or as a conservative, but rather as a deeply concerned human being who's simply not okay with the dehumanization and unnecessary suffering of our newest neighbors. And I don't think you should be either. Could have worked overseas, but realized I was probably most use in the United States building bridges between existing citizens and new immigrants and refugees. Many of you in the room who've grown up here know that North Carolina's gone through some changes. We've had about a 500 to 750% increase in our newcomer population just over the last 20 years, bringing tremendous new ethnic, cultural, and religious diversity to both our large cities as well as our small towns. A lot of this diversity comes on top of what has been a very complicated and often shameful history between black and white populations with some beautiful moments, perhaps especially here in Greensboro. And in a sentence with a semicolon, that's kind of the story of us right now. And each of us, individually, each congregation, each community has a crucial question to answer. And that is, in the midst of these changes, are we going to fear one another as strangers or embrace one another as neighbors? And I don't think that's just a kumbaya question. I actually think it sits at the center of this heated debate. And how we answer this question together will have a significant impact on our economic, social, cultural, spiritual future for generations to come. And I found that this question is best answered, and I would ask you to take off your political hat for the next 10 to 15 minutes and put on your faith hat. That stranger neighbor question is a question that Faith Action's been trying to help Greensboro answer for the last 20 years. We do 3 things. We serve thousands of new immigrants, many who have limited or no status each year, help them with food, housing, health care. I assure you, one of the biggest myths that's out there is that they somehow receive social welfare benefits. It's simply not true. We also provide an ID for those that don't have access to government-issued forms of ID that I'll talk about a little bit later. Second thing we do is we educate our larger community on issues related to immigration and diversity so they're not believing everything they hear in the evening news or on political debates. And never forget the human story, the beautiful story behind migration. The third thing we do is bring those 2 groups together so as much as possible they're coming together and they're eating and they're laughing and they're singing and they're crying and they're dancing and they're kicking a soccer ball together so that strangers become neighbors. Most all faiths have the shared value around the inherent dignity of all human beings as a beloved part of creation. And the Judeo-Christian tradition, we're called to welcome the stranger not just once or twice, but nearly 40 times, and to love our neighbors as ourselves. You remember when Jesus was asked, "Who's my neighbor?" He didn't list off this culture or that nation, but tells the Good Samaritan story. And in that story, Jesus lifts up a Samaritan, somebody outside of his culture, outside of his faith, as the best example of God's love in the world. The unwanted stranger as the best example. And one of the deepest themes throughout the Bible is that welcoming the stranger means welcoming God. This has certainly been true for me throughout my work in detention centers and at Faith Action. One of the most important scriptures for me is never neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for in doing so, some may have entertained angels unawares. I'd love to get that tattooed on my body. I'm just not sure where it'll all fit. What are some of the things we hear about immigrants these days? Note I didn't say what are some of the bad things we hear about immigrants. It's clear we have a dominant, dehumanizing story of immigrants as a problem, as strangers to fear. But 99% of the people who ring our doorbell across the street are people that have strong connections to family and faith. Hardworking, loyal neighbors who would be the first to get in line if there were a line to get into. And that's another huge misconception. There is simply no pathway under current immigration law for the majority of poor immigrants fleeing devastating poverty and violence to receive legal status. Otherwise, you wouldn't cross a desert where nearly 60% of women are raped and a person dies every other day due to a lack of water if you had an easier pathway to get into. And again, I say that not as a political statement, but as somebody who's worked alongside an immigration attorney for the past 5 years who's had to give bad news nearly every day to people who deserve a chance in line. And what is the term we so often hear for those with limited or no status? You know it. Illegal. Now, back when I was playing Little League as a kid, I was also stealing liquor and cigarettes from a local grocery store. Happen to be a pastor now, so I've changed a few things. And this is a safe space. But very seriously, according to federal law, what I did, which I didn't have a good reason to do, was a higher level of crime than crossing a border for your first time or overstaying a visa, which is a civil misdemeanor, not a crime. Do you think anybody's ever called me illegal? How many of you ever committed a crime before? It's a safe space. How would it make you feel if somebody called you that? Not just once, but that was the dominant story they told about you and your family and your people over and over and over again when all you were trying to do is keep your family alive. And yet dozens of our clients and friends with no status last year were put in orange and blue jumpsuits and sent 8 hours south to a massive detention facility in southern Georgia, and most had committed no crime. One of over 250 across the nation, where over 30,000 are held on any given day. And guess whose taxpayer money pays for that? I invite you to take a trip with us to visit our friends and neighbors in this detention center this summer and fall. You'll leave changed. It'll become personal for you too. There are thousands in our community, hundreds of thousands in our state, and millions in our nation that are at risk of detention and deportation, devastating families and creating significant fear and concern in our community. Many are afraid to go to school or church anymore, not as willing to report crimes. And when we choose to believe the narrative of immigrants as strangers to fear, our brain kicks in that kind of fight or flight response, as if there's no other choice but a hard line one. But I believe a big part of what the stories and lessons of the Bible teach us is that there is another choice, that we can evolve beyond the fear, can make a choice to welcome and embrace our newest neighbors. And I recognize that this is difficult for most. It feels uncomfortable, risky to go outside of one's bubble. But for me, the purpose of life is not ease or contentment or just happiness, but meaning. And few things bring greater meaning than unlikely friendships with those who are different from you, especially when you choose to proudly stand alongside of them during times of great fear and uncertainty. And some of the best books and movies speak to this. Think about Brian's Song, The Shawshank Redemption, Schindler's List. Building bridges, developing relationships across lines of culture, faith, and nationality is a dance. Anybody know what dance they teach you when they want to teach you your culture in Southern Indiana in junior high? Square dancing. You're all in a circle for some reason. There's a lot of clapping, a lot of do-si-dos and swing your partners. Well, I go to school in Miami, Florida. On my 18th birthday, I just arrived, and some of my Latino friends took me out to the clubs in South Beach. You can see where this story's going. And I walk in, and I hear beats, and I see people moving their bodies in ways that were not, natural to what I got going on. So I booked for the door. How many of you ever learned a new dance before? How's it feel? I can hear you. Awkward. Yeah. It's like the one thing that unites humanity is the awkwardness of learning a new dance. And so my friends pulled me back and they said, no, you're doing fine. Just breathe. It'll come. 20 years later and the hips still haven't come. But I said, the only way I'm staying on this dance floor right now is if we go back to my dorm room. And I had actually brought a little cassette tape of square dancing with me in the late 90s. And I said, we put that on and you look like a fool for a while. And they did until 4 in the morning. We could talk about dance because it's literally the kind of nonverbal expression of our culture. But dance is also a good analogy when it comes to building bridges between newcomers and existing citizens. And we usually see it play out in 3 ways. And you all see it. The first is this. Okay, you're new to this country. That's fine. But you're going to learn my culture, at least how I understand my culture, my language, our laws. I'm going to be leading this dance, and if you mess up, you could end up in one of those detention centers. Got it? And you hear that in people's tone of voices, and you hear it in their words all the time. Second way is, wow, you're new to this country. That must be so difficult. You know what? Forget our language, forget our laws. You lead this dance the entire time. While I appreciate the empathy behind that, I don't think that works either. Faith Action, we believe the only way we're going to build positive relationships and move forward on this issue is to recognize that to God, both of our cultures, both of our dances are of tremendous value. And the only way this is going to work is if we take turns leading that dance. But here's the thing. That means we're both going to feel awkward. We're both going to want to book for the door. We're both going to stumble on each other's feet. But if you want to make America great again, be the kind of people who stay on the dance floor. I promise you, if you stay on long enough, you'll start to learn another human being's dance, and you'll learn yours, and before you know it, you will have created a beautiful new dance together. And I'm telling you, some of America's most beautiful moments is that synergy when they create a dance together. I want to share a brief story of a client and friend of ours who's been here a long time. Incredibly kind and caring woman, no criminal history, no status. She's got a lot of difficulty finding work. She heard about a paraplegic war veteran in rural Alamance County, but a reputation for being difficult to care for. Many others had been fired. And when she came, he quickly made it clear he didn't like that she was Mexican, didn't like that she didn't speak the language fluently, said disparaging things about immigrants. She hung in there with him, bathed him, cared for him with great tenderness, had him try new foods that she cooked that he began to love, and as doctors said, were greatly helping him regain strength. They became friends. She even agreed to a hunting trip together. I've seen the picture. It's incredible. He's decked out in his wheelchair looking like Rambo, and this petite woman that wouldn't hurt a fly with a shotgun and camouflage. And one day while he was watching the news, he made some comment about those damn illegals. And she stood up to him. She said, "That's me you're talking about." He hadn't known that she didn't have any status and felt very remorseful. And so he scrounged up what little money he had to pay for an attorney and found out under current law there was no pathway for her. And just as he was starting to see things differently, to really transform, even speak out on this issue, his health took a turn. And there weren't many there for his last few days, but she was there. She was the one holding his hands as he passed. That's right. That's beautiful. And if we're going to move forward in a positive way on this issue and many others, we have to be willing to dance like those two did. And most usually don't start off caring about those different from us. It takes some education, it takes some willingness to go outside our comfort zones, and a whole lot of time and practice. But once it happens, these unlikely friendships go on to become some of the most meaningful relationships in our lives. What keeps me up at night, though, is the stark difference between how long it takes for a heart and mind to change. Oftentimes that moves at a snail's pace. And the unnecessary suffering of those on the margins of society, which seems to increase with greater urgency every day. And I know people aren't just going to wake up and change if we name and shame them on Facebook. We need a pathway for how people's hearts and minds transform, for how two groups of people who view one another as strangers to fear can go through a heart and mind journey to embrace one another as neighbors, and then put their faith into action to change larger systems. There's no incentive for most in Washington to change the law, which hasn't had meaningful change in about 30 years, because not enough people in the community are expressing their concern and demanding change on this issue. We've learned that people don't take action until an issue becomes personal for them. And that is why we focus on stranger-to-neighbor relationships at Faith Action. The more you know somebody, the more you care. The more you care about somebody, the more likely you are to serve, love, and protect them, especially when the stuff hits the fan. In the meantime, at the local level, for you and I, in the midst of a broken immigration system, the question remains, are we strangers or are we neighbors? And how do we pick up the pieces together and make the most out of the community that we have, the community that God has brought to the front door at Faith Action? As I come to an end, I want to share the story of what it looks like when strangers on a larger community-wide scale. 5 years ago, we had numerous clients who were victims of very serious crimes, not wanting to report to police because they were afraid. So we've decided to bring law enforcement and the immigrant community together for a series of dialogues in the church, where over time they learned to dance. Law enforcement, to their credit, listened to people's stories, their hardships, their fear of law enforcement, and began to understand that many had no access to driver's license or government-issued IDs. And the immigrant community did the same for law enforcement. They learned about the laws in the United States and that law enforcement's role wasn't to enforce federal immigration, but to serve and protect all residents. And they needed the immigrant community's help in creating safer communities. One officer at a particularly moving dialogue shared that his own parents had crossed a border to keep him alive. That he grew up at their feet picking tobacco in Reedsville and was called all sorts of names. But there are enough people, maybe like you, who also saw him as a human being with gifts to offer our community, welcomed and embraced him and his family. So when he got older, he chose to give back, to serve, protect, and is willing even to die for his community as an officer. And when he shared that, tears flowed, something broke open. The Holy Spirit was very much moving in that space. And the idea came organically through dialogue that what if Faith Action produced an ID card? And together, what if we create a process where everyone agrees for how people get the ID, that they need to go through an orientation, provide proof of ID and address, and maybe, perhaps, law enforcement would be willing to accept it as a tool to better identify, serve, and protect those who need their help, instead of unnecessarily arresting people because they don't have valid identification, which could be the starting point of detention and deportation. And a year after agreeing to partner with the program, the chief was able to say publicly that nearly a dozen people have come forward with very serious crimes, rape, assault, trafficking, would never have come forward had it not been for law enforcement accepting the ID, seeing immigrants as people with names and faces and stories, as neighbors to embrace. And that officer I mentioned is now the first Latino sergeant in Greensboro Police Department history. And slowly but surely, other sectors came on board. Health, so people could check in at appointments. Schools, so people could register their children at school. Businesses, where you get $3 off at the Children's Museum if you show that ID. It became a wonderful way to integrate the community. And we started working with other communities to replicate the program, from Durham to Roanoke Rapids to Boone, the entire city of Cincinnati, and last year we trained the entire city of Houston on the Faith Action ID Drive and Dialogue model. And this all came out of $5,000, sacred space, and the willingness of our local police and newcomer community to dance together. Now, this may not be the ultimate answer, but it sure as heck is a bright light in the right direction. You can get your ID too at our next ID Drive at the Community Theater on May 19th. What I've learned is if we give a pinky's worth of welcome to our newest neighbors, some kind of humane and fair pathway forward, most of them will repay it back tenfold and go on to be some of our best workers, teachers, scientists, soldiers, preachers, officers. Appreciate you all listening. I know it's a heavy topic, but I hope that this became a bit more personal for you this evening, and you'll leave more willing to dance and put your faith into action alongside of your newest neighbors. Some other things you can start doing include continuing to educate yourself, use non-biased resources, and participate in some of our Stranger to Neighbor programs that bring our diverse community together. And don't be afraid the next time a family member or a friend or a colleague says something disparaging about immigrants. Stand up. Volunteer with Faith Action or another group to serve, love, and protect your neighbors, and call your representatives every day if you have to until change comes. I want to end with a Martin Luther King Jr. quote. We may have come on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And the next step is yours. Thanks.